The morning Adelaide Gentry rode into trouble. The sky was the color of a bruise healing wrong, and she had exactly $4.30 to her name. She had been traveling for 9 days through the Arizona Territory, the year being 1882, and the land had not been kind to her. It was dry and enormous and indifferent in the way that land out west could be, stretching in every direction like God had unrolled a bolt of red-brown cloth and forgotten to cut it. The stagecoach she had been riding had broken an axle 2 miles east of nowhere in particular, and the driver, a wiry man named Dobbs with a permanent squint, had declared with grim certainty that they would not be moving again until he sent word to the nearest town for parts. The nearest town, he explained, was a place called Callow Creek, some 14 miles north, and the other 2 passengers, a pair of brothers heading to Tucson on business, had decided to walk it. Adelaide had refused that particular adventure, having blisters on her heels the size of nickels and a trunk full of belongings she was not willing to abandon on the roadside. So she had waited. She sat on the trunk in the shade of the stalled coach while Dobbs grumbled under the axle, and she took stock of her situation the way a sensible woman does when things have gone sideways. She was 24 years old. She had left Savannah, Georgia, 3 weeks ago with a modest inheritance from her late aunt, enough to get herself to Arizona Territory, where her cousin Ruth had written promising there was good work and good land for women willing to make a go of it. Ruth's letters had stopped coming 2 months ago, but Adelaide was not the type to be stopped by silence. She had brown hair that curled at the ends no matter what she did to it, gray eyes that people sometimes called stormy and sometimes called sharp depending on their mood, and a constitution that her mother had always described as stubborn to the point of inconvenience. She was stubborn now, sitting on her trunk, fanning herself with the brim of her hat. It was late afternoon when the rider appeared on the ridge to the west. She saw him first as a dark shape against the bruised sky, a man on a horse silhouetted at the top of a long rise, and she shaded her eyes with her palm and squinted. He sat very still up there, the way a man does when he is reading the land, looking at something below with careful attention. Then he moved. The horse came down the ridge at a steady pace, not hurrying, not dawdling, and as he drew closer Adelaide could make out more detail. A tall horse, dark bay, beautifully built. The man on it sat straight without being stiff, the way men who have spent most of their lives in the saddle tend to sit, like the horse was an extension of themselves and not a separate creature requiring constant management. He pulled up about 20 feet from the stalled coach and looked at the situation with those careful eyes. "Axel," he said. It was not a question. "Axel," Dobbs confirmed from underneath the coach, apparently unbothered by the fact that a stranger had materialized from the landscape. The rider looked then at Adelaide, and she looked back at him with the directness she had never quite trained out of herself. He was somewhere in his late 20s, she thought, with a jaw that had 2 days of dark stubble on it and eyes the color of strong coffee. His hat was a working hat, battered and sweat-stained, not the kind a man wears when he is trying to impress someone. He wore a plain shirt, dark with dust from the trail, and his gun belt was positioned with the practiced ease of a man who carried one not for show but because the country made it practical. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "you waiting on parts from Callow Creek?" "That appears to be the situation," Adelaide said pleasantly. "Unless you are carrying an axle in your saddlebag, in which case today would be significantly improved." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "Afraid not. I'm heading back to the Greystone Spread about 3 miles from here. We can get a wagon out to bring these folks in, but it'll be tomorrow morning before that happens." "I see," Adelaide said. She looked at the sky, which was beginning to go orange at the edges the way it did before the dark came on fast and complete out here in the territory. "And in the meantime," the rider said, studying her with those steady coffee-colored eyes, "the desert at night is not a comfortable place for a lady alone with only old Dobbs for company." He paused. "No offense, Dobbs." "None taken," said Dobbs from under the coach. The rider was quiet for a moment, thinking. Adelaide watched him think, because she had learned that you could tell a great deal about a man's character by the quality of his silence. Some men's silences were restless and uncomfortable. Some were calculated. This man's was settled, like he was genuinely working through the problem and not performing his own helpfulness. "My horse is fresh," he said at last. "And there is a proper boarding house in Callow Creek run by a woman named Clara Hatch who keeps a clean establishment. I can lead you in on Scout here, get you settled before nightfall, and send a wagon back for your trunk and for Dobbs first thing in the morning." Adelaide looked at the horse he called Scout. The animal was looking back at her with liquid dark eyes that seemed to hold an opinion about the situation. She looked at the rider. "You would lend me your horse?" she asked. "I would ride in alongside you," he said. "I'm going to Callow Creek anyway to pick up supplies. Scout can carry double if needed, but if you would rather ride alone, I have a second horse tied at the creek about a quarter-mile up. Fern, my mare. She's steady and gentle and could carry you in without trouble." Dobbs crawled out from under the coach then, wiping his hands on a rag that had long since given up any pretense of being clean. He looked at the rider with what appeared to be comfortable familiarity. "That you Ford, Perry Ford?" "That's right," the rider said. "I'll be fine here," Dobbs announced, apparently satisfied by the name. "Got my bedroll and enough jerked beef to last me 2 days. You go on and take the lady in, Perry. I'll be right here when your wagon comes." Adelaide considered all of this. She was a practical woman, and the practical facts were these. The desert at night dropped 40 degrees and had creatures in it with fangs and bad intentions. She had nowhere to sleep. Her trunk would be perfectly safe locked here overnight, and the man before her had been vouched for by a stagecoach driver who knew his name and showed no alarm at his presence. She had also noticed that the horse named Scout had a coat that gleamed with proper care, and a man who kept his horses well usually had at least a reasonable character. "Very well, Mr. Ford," she said, rising from her trunk and smoothing her skirts. "I would be grateful for the escort." He dismounted in one smooth motion and tied Scout to the wheel of the stagecoach, then walked the quarter-mile to the creek with her, the dry grasses rustling around their boots, and there was the mare he had mentioned. Fern was a dun-colored horse with a white blaze on her nose and an expression of patient wisdom that Adelaide immediately found reassuring. The saddle on Fern was well maintained, the leather oiled and clean, and Perry Ford checked every buckle and strap with methodical care before he helped Adelaide mount. His hand was warm and calloused when he cupped her boot to give her a leg up, and he stepped back immediately after, with the manner of a man who understood that courtesy required both helpfulness and restraint. "She rides smooth," he told her. "Keep your heels down and she'll follow Scout without you needing to ask much of her." "I can ride," Adelaide told him, settling into the saddle with a competence that seemed to surprise him slightly. "I can see that," he said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing again that was almost a smile. They rode north toward Callow Creek with the sun going down behind them, and the desert turning all those colors that made even Adelaide, who had been distinctly unenchanted with the territory for 9 consecutive days, admit privately that it was spectacular. The red rocks went gold and then amber and then a deep purple, and the sky above them was a riot of orange and pink that reflected off the few clouds like fire. Perry Ford rode beside her on Scout, and he was quiet in a way that was companionable rather than awkward, occasionally pointing out things along the trail with a word or two. A family of quail running through the sage, a hawk riding a thermal so high up it was barely a speck. "You know this land," Adelaide observed. "Born about 40 miles from here," he said. "Rode most of it at one time or another. And you work the Greystone spread." "I run it," he said. "It was my father's. He passed on 3 years ago. It's mine now." "I am sorry for your loss," she said, and she meant it in the straightforward way she meant most things. He acknowledged that with a small nod. "And yourself?" "You are clearly not from Arizona territory." "Georgia," she said. "Savannah." She told him about her cousin Ruth and the letters and the plan, and he listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet a moment. "Ruth Gentry," he said. "Married name Calloway." Adelaide straightened in the saddle. "Yes. Do you know her?" "She married Tom Calloway, who has a homestead about 8 miles west of Callow Creek. They have been out there about 2 years." He paused, and something in the pause made Adelaide's stomach tighten just slightly. "Mrs. Calloway has been unwell this past winter. I do not know the details. You should ask Clara Hatch when we get in. Clara knows everything that happens in and around Callow Creek." "Is she alive?" Adelaide asked plainly. Perry Ford looked at her with those steady eyes. "As of 2 weeks ago, yes. I saw Tom Calloway at the feed store and he said she was getting better." Adelaide released a breath she had not quite known she was holding. "Good," she said. "Good." They rode on, and the first stars began to appear, and Callow Creek came into view below them as they crested a long hill, its lights yellow and warm in the growing dark like scattered embers. It was a proper town, not a big one but solid. Adelaide could see a main street with a row of buildings, a church steeple, what looked like a livery and a hotel, and a dry goods store all shuttered for the evening. It had the look of a place that was trying to become permanent, which she found oddly comforting. "There she is," Perry Ford said, reining Scout to a brief stop at the crest of the hill, the way a man does when he is showing you something he is quietly proud of even if it is not his to own. "Callow Creek." Adelaide looked at the lights of the town spread below her, and then she looked at the man beside her on the dark bay horse, his profile clean against the darkening sky, and she thought that she had been in the territory for 9 days and had not met one interesting person until approximately 2 hours ago. "Mr. Ford," she said as they began the descent toward the lights, "I have not thanked you properly." "No need," he said. "There is always a need," she replied. "You lent me your horse and your time, and you are escorting me into an unfamiliar town. That deserves acknowledgement." He looked at her then, really looked, and she met his gaze without looking away. Something passed between them in that moment, some kind of recognition, the way two people sometimes understand in a wordless instant that the other one is worth knowing. "You are welcome, Miss Gentry," he said. There was warmth in it now, genuine and unguarded, and she was almost certain she saw a real smile, brief and a little surprised, like it had gotten out before he could think better of it. They rode down into Callow Creek as the last light left the sky. Clara Hatch's boarding house was exactly as Perry Ford had described it, clean, properly run, and presided over by a woman of about 50 who had a no-nonsense handshake and an encyclopedic knowledge of every soul within 20 miles of Callow Creek. She was broad-shouldered and efficient, with iron-gray hair pinned up tight and an apron that was always spotless. She took one look at Adelaide on the doorstep with Perry Ford behind her leading the horses, and she opened the door wide. "Adelaide Gentry," Perry said. "This is Clara Hatch. Clara, Miss Gentry was stranded by a broken axle south of town. Her trunk is coming in by wagon tomorrow morning with Dobbs Alcott." "Dobbs again," Clara said, with the fond exasperation of a woman long accustomed to the general helplessness of men in mechanical situations. "Come in, come in. I have supper on still and a room on the second floor with a window. You look like a woman who needs a window." Adelaide laughed, which surprised her slightly, because she had not laughed in several days. "I very much am," she agreed. She turned to Perry Ford, who was still standing on the porch step, holding both horses. He had his hat in his hand now, she noticed, which she thought was a rather old-fashioned and entirely genuine courtesy. "Thank you again," she said, "truly." "I will see that your wagon goes out at first light," he said, "and I hope you find your cousin well." He meant to leave then, she could see it in the way he turned back to the horses. But Clara Hatch put a hand on the doorframe with the authority of a woman who ran the social infrastructure of an entire town. "Perry Ford," she said, "you will stay and have a plate of supper before you ride out to your place in the dark. I have beef stew and you look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday." A look crossed his face that was somewhere between protest and capitulation, and Adelaide recognized it as the look of a man who knew when he was beaten. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and tied the horses at the post. They ate at Clara's big kitchen table, the three of them, and the stew was extraordinary, thick with carrots and potatoes, and seasoned with something herbal and warm that made Adelaide feel, for the first time in weeks, genuinely comfortable. Clara produced a loaf of bread that had come out of the oven that afternoon and a crock of butter, and talked the entire time about Callow Creek with an ease that made Adelaide feel immediately informed and oriented. There was the sheriff, a man named Harlan Walsh who was dependable. There was the dry goods store run by a family named Parrots who had come out from St. Louis and were well liked. There was a doctor, young Dr. Emmett Park, fresh from his training and settled in town for 2 years now. There was the church with its pastor, Reverend Miles, who gave shorter sermons than most. And there was Perry Ford, who sat across from Adelaide at the table eating his stew with the methodical focus of a man who had worked hard all day and needed fuel, listening to Clara talk with occasional brief contributions, and who, Adelaide noticed, had very good manners. Not the studied, performative manners of men trying to impress, but the natural manners of a person who had been raised right and had kept the habit. At one point Clara said, in the artless way that was clearly quite artful, "Perry, when is the last time you came in for a proper social occasion? The church dance last spring, was it?" "I have been busy," he said, with the patience of a man who has heard this particular line of conversation before. "A man running a ranch alone can always find reasons to be busy," Clara said, entirely to the air, not looking at anyone in particular. Adelaide focused on her bread. After supper Perry Ford said his good nights with a reserve that Adelaide might have mistaken for coldness if she had not already spent 2 hours riding beside him through the desert dusk and learned the difference. He shook Clara's hand and nodded to Adelaide and put his hat back on, and at the door he paused. "Miss Gentry," he said, "I hope tomorrow is a better day." "It already is," she replied honestly, "thanks to you." He held her gaze for just a moment longer than strictly necessary, and then he was gone, and she could hear his boots on the porch steps, and then the horses moving off into the dark. Clara Hatch was very busy suddenly with the supper dishes and said nothing at all, which Adelaide thought was extremely tactful. She asked Clara who the cowboy was before the woman had a chance to stop talking about him, which was perhaps 20 minutes after supper while they were washing up together. "Perry Ford," Clara said, handing her a dish to dry, "is the best man for 40 miles in any direction and has been too busy keeping his ranch alive to notice it himself. His father, God rest him, built the Greystone with nothing but determination and bad luck for the first 5 years. Perry took it over at 25 after his father passed and has turned it into something genuinely fine. He runs about 300 head of cattle, has 4 hands who have worked for him for years, and the horses he breeds are sought after all the way to Tucson. That bay you rode in on, Scout, sired by a stallion Perry bought with every dollar he had saved for 3 years." Adelaide folded the dish towel with more attention than it required. "Is he a good man? Truly?" Clara looked at her with the direct assessment of a woman who did not waste time on indirection. "He is the kind of man who, when old Mavis Parrots's roof blew off in a windstorm last November, organized 6 men and had it fixed in a day and would not take a cent. He is the kind of man who checks on families during drought and delivers goods when they cannot get to town. He is also," she added, putting away a bowl, "quite private about his feelings, which some people mistake for coldness. He is not cold, he is careful." Adelaide took this information and put it in the careful mental filing system she had built over 24 years of paying attention to the world. "What happened to his mother?" she asked. "Passed when he was 16, Clara said. "He and his father managed the ranch together until his father's heart gave out. Perry's been alone out there since." Adelaide looked out the kitchen window at the dark Arizona night, where a million stars were doing what stars in the territory did, showing off without any restraint whatsoever. "He has a good horse," she said finally. Clara smiled at the sink. "That he does." She slept better than she had in weeks in the room with the window, which looked east and led in the first gray light of morning along with a breeze that smelled of sage and distance. She was dressed and downstairs before Clara had finished making the coffee. Tom Calloway came into town that morning, which was unexpected, and which told Adelaide immediately that Perry Ford had sent word the night before, because Tom Calloway was clearly not a man who came to town on a Tuesday without reason. He was a lean, weathered man of about 30, with a handshake like a vice and eyes that were creased at the corners from squinting into the sun. He found Adelaide at Clara's breakfast table and told her that Ruth was recovered from the fever that had kept her abed all winter, that she was thin but fierce as ever, and that Ruth had sent him personally with the wagon when the Ford boys' rider came out at dawn with the news. She wanted to come herself, Tom said, accepting a coffee from Clara with the automatic gratitude of a man unaccustomed to anything being given to him without asking. I made her stay put. She is better, but not that better. I will come to you, Adelaide said immediately. As soon as my trunk arrives. She paused. Perry Ford sent you word this morning. His man Danny came out at sunrise, Tom confirmed. Said Ford had brought a Miss Gentry from Savannah into town, and that she was looking for Ruth. Adelaide absorbed this. Perry Ford had ridden out to his ranch in the dark, and in the morning had sent a man with 8 miles of riding ahead of him to notify her cousin's husband before she had even come downstairs for breakfast. She thought about that for a moment, and then she thought about what Clara had said about the kind of man he was, and she felt something shift in her chest with a quiet, tectonic certainty, the way something important settles into its proper place. The trunk arrived with Dobbs Alcott before 10 o'clock, the old driver cheerful and well-rested, and full of opinions about the quality of the bacon he had been fed at whatever ranch had taken him in for the night. Adelaide reclaimed her belongings, paid Clara for the room with money that she could afford now that the immediate crisis had passed, and went with Tom Calloway in his wagon to see her cousin Ruth. Ruth was thin, as advertised, but she was Ruth, which meant she was managing the situation of her own recovery with considerable energy. She pulled Adelaide into a fierce embrace at the door of the homestead, a small but solid house that Tom had clearly built with care, and then held her at arm's length and looked her over. "You look well," Ruth said, which in Ruth's vocabulary meant more than the words themselves. "I had an adventure getting here," Adelaide told her, and sat down at Ruth's kitchen table and told her the whole story. Ruth listened with the bright attention of a woman who had been confined to a homestead through a long illness and was hungry for the world. When Adelaide finished, Ruth was very still for a moment. "Perry Ford," Ruth said. "Do you know him?" "Everyone knows him," Ruth said. "He brought Tom a load of hay at cost when we first came out here and had nothing and the grass was short. He does not make a great show of things." She looked at her cousin with an expression that Adelaide recognized as Ruth forming an opinion at high speed. "And you asked Clara about him?" "I did," Adelaide admitted, which was practical. "I knew nothing about the man." "Practical," Ruth said, with a tone that managed to be entirely skeptical and entirely warm at the same time. "Adelaide, you rode into town on the man's horse." "His mare," Adelaide corrected. "He rode Scout." Ruth laughed for the first time in months, and the sound of it filled the small house, and Tom Calloway, who was outside seeing to the horses, smiled to himself without knowing why. Adelaide settled into life at the Calloway homestead with a practicality that surprised no one who knew her. There was work to be done, and Ruth was still building her strength, and Adelaide had not come 2,000 miles to sit in a chair and look at the landscape. She was up at dawn and learned quickly, the rhythms of the homestead coming to her with a naturalness that pleased Tom Calloway enormously, because Tom was a man who deeply respected useful people. She went into Callow Creek twice in that first week, once for supplies with Tom and once on her own with the wagon, having demonstrated to Tom's satisfaction that she could handle a team without embarrassing herself. She was not looking for Perry Ford, or so she told herself with reasonable conviction, but she was aware of a particular quality of attention that attached itself to every tall, dark bay horse she saw. She saw him on the Thursday of her second week. She had come into town for thread and lamp oil, and was loading the wagon outside Parrott's dry goods when she heard a familiar voice behind her in the street, low and unhurried. She turned, and there he was, Perry Ford, outside the hardware store across the way with a man she did not know, discussing something with the focused practicality of men talking about things that needed fixing. He had not seen her yet. She looked at him for a moment with the honesty she tried to give everything. He was taller than she had remembered, or perhaps it was just that in the daylight, without the drama of the desert sunset behind him, he was more simply himself. He had a new shirt on today, or at least a cleaner one, and his hat sat back a little on his head the way hats do when a man is relaxed and talking to someone he knows well. Then he turned, the way people sometimes do when they are being watched, and his eyes found her across the street with an immediacy that made her heart do something brisk and embarrassing. He said something brief to the man beside him and crossed the street. "Miss Gentry," he said, when he reached her, and she thought she detected something that was not quite relief and not quite pleasure but was made up of elements of both. "Mr. Ford," she said, "I have been meaning to find a way to thank you properly. I was not able to in the chaos of the morning you left." "You found your cousin," he said. It was a statement. "Tom Calloway was at Clara's table before my coffee was poured," she said. "That was your doing." He looked at his boots briefly, which was the closest thing to modesty she had seen from him. "I knew you were worried," he said. "It seemed the thing to do." She held out her hand, not as a social formality but as a real thing, and he took it, and his handshake was firm and warm and lasted just a beat longer than strictly necessary. "I am in Callow Creek most Thursdays," she said, "if you find yourself in town." He looked at her with those steady coffee eyes. "I find myself in town most Thursdays," he said. "What a coincidence," she said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing that was almost a smile, except this time it went all the way, and it was the kind of smile that changed his face considerably, opened it up, and she decided on the spot that she would make it her project to see it again as often as possible. He helped her finish loading the wagon because it was there to be helped with, and he was a man who helped things, and when she drove out of town she was aware of him watching from the sidewalk, his hat brim slightly lifted. She did not look back. She thought about it, and she decided against it, and then at the edge of town she looked back. He was still watching. When he saw her look, he touched the brim of his hat. She faced forward and drove home and told herself that she was being perfectly sensible. The Thursdays in Callow Creek became a thing. It was not planned, not exactly, or at least that was what both of them maintained to themselves in those early weeks. They would encounter each other outside Parrott's, or at the post office, or at Clara's if she happened to be having coffee there, and they would talk. Adelaide was direct and curious and asked questions that other people apparently found intrusive, but that Perry Ford seemed to welcome, as though he had been waiting a long time for someone to take a genuine interest in the answers. She asked about the ranch, about the horses, about his father, about what the territory had been like when he was a boy. He answered carefully and thoroughly, and in return asked questions of his own that were equally real about Georgia, about her family, about what she intended to do now that she was here. She told him she intended to stay. She said it simply, and he heard it with a stillness that suggested it landed somewhere important. She had been in the territory for 6 weeks when he asked her to ride with him on a Saturday. He came to the Calloway homestead in the morning, having sent word ahead because he had the manners to do that, and he brought Fern again for her, saddled and ready. Tom Calloway watched from the porch with the carefully blank expression of a man trying very hard not to have an expression. They rode east into country that Perry knew the way a man knows a place he has loved all his life, and he talked more than he usually did, which she noted and appreciated. He showed her a spring she would never have found on her own, tucked between 2 red rock formations with actual green grass around it, and a cottonwood tree throwing shade. He showed her from a ridge the full sweep of the Greystone Ranch, the main house and the outbuildings and the corrals with horses moving in them like small dark figures. "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant the ranch, but she was also possibly thinking about the man sitting on the horse beside her. "My father always said that good land requires good stewardship," Perry said. "He meant it as a lesson about responsibility, but I think he also just loved the place." "And you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I cannot imagine being anywhere else," he said. She looked at the ranch spread out below them and thought about what it would mean to belong somewhere like that, with that kind of bone-deep certainty. She had been a woman somewhat at loose ends for her adult life, doing useful things in Savannah but never quite finding the thing that felt like hers. "I think I understand that," she said. "I have not felt it yet, but I think I understand what it would feel like." He turned to look at her, and something in his expression had opened in a way that was new and deliberate, like a door he had decided to stop keeping closed. "This land is better shared," he said. It was a simple statement, maybe even a statement about ranching in general, about neighbors and communities and cooperation. But the way he said it, looking at her, left very little ambiguity about the full range of what he meant. Adelaide looked back at him steadily. "I believe that is true," she said. They rode back to the Calloway homestead in the afternoon, and he was invited to supper, which Ruth had clearly planned on regardless of the outcome of the ride, because there was enough food for 6 people, and it was all extremely good. Ruth was recovered enough now to move around her kitchen with her full previous efficiency, and the meal was a testament to what a determined woman could produce when she had something to celebrate. Tom and Ruth talked, and Adelaide and Perry talked, and occasionally all 4 of them talked, and the evening had the warm, uncomplicated feeling of people who are becoming real to one another rather than just acquainted. He left when the stars were well out, shaking hands with Tom at the door and accepting Ruth's warm thanks for the hat tip toward Tom that morning weeks ago. At the door he turned to Adelaide. "Next Saturday," he said, "if you would like." "I would," she said. He rode out into the dark, and Ruth materialized at Adelaide's shoulder with the inevitability of a woman who had been waiting to materialize. "Adelaide," Ruth said. "Do not," Adelaide said. "He looks at you like Ruth." "Like you are a spring in dry country," Ruth finished, entirely ignoring the interruption. Adelaide went inside and found something to do with her hands, and Ruth smiled at her back. The Saturdays became a thing too. Perry Ford was not an impulsive man. He had thought his way through most things in his life with the same methodical care he gave to the business of the ranch, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize that what was happening with Adelaide Gentry was something that deserved the same care. But she was not like the ranch, where patience and planning were always the right approach. She was a kind of urgency wrapped in calm, and he found himself riding toward the Calloway homestead on Saturday mornings with a purposefulness that he had not applied to anything personal in years. She rode well, and she asked good questions, and she laughed with an honesty that he found quite extraordinary. Not the careful social laugh of a woman performing happiness, but the real thing, sudden and genuine, and then over, like a bird startled from a bush. She had opinions about everything and stated them plainly, and listened to his counter-opinions with real attention, and changed her view when she was persuaded and held it when she was not. He had never found conversation this engaging, and had begun to understand, in the careful private corner of himself, that he was in a considerable amount of trouble. It was on the 4th Saturday that things became explicit. They had ridden north to a meadow he knew, where the grass was still green enough to sit down in, and they had brought food from Clara's bakery wrapped in cloth, and they sat under a juniper tree and ate and talked, and the afternoon had that particular golden quality that autumn was beginning to bring to the territory, softer and more forgiving than the brutal summer light. She had told him something about her childhood, about her father who had died when she was 12 and her mother who had raised her and her 2 brothers alone, with a ferocity and intelligence that Adelaide, clearly considered the benchmark of womanhood. She talked about her father with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone who has integrated a loss into themselves rather than around it, and he listened to all of it with the full attention he gave to things that mattered. When she finished, she looked at him with those gray eyes that were not stormy today but very clear and said, "You have been different these past weeks." "Different how?" he asked, because he was interested in what she saw. "More open," she said. "You started out being careful with me, which I understood. You did not know me, but lately you seem to have decided something." He looked at the grass in front of him for a moment. A small lizard was doing something urgent at the base of the juniper. "I have," he said. "What did you decide?" she asked, in the direct way that he had come to think of as one of the most attractive things about her, because it made dishonesty impossible and ease unnecessary. "That you are the most interesting person I have encountered in a considerable amount of time," he said, "and that I would like, if you are willing, to court you properly." The word properly hung in the autumn air between them, and Adelaide looked at it for a moment. "Properly," she said. "I am aware that is an old-fashioned word," he said, and there was a trace of something vulnerable in his voice that she recognized immediately as a man who had not said something like this in a very long time, possibly ever. "It is not too old-fashioned," she said. "Perry." It was the first time she had used his name without the Mr., and it landed between them with a warmth that surprised him into looking directly at her. "I would be very willing." He smiled then, the full real one, and she thought, as she had thought the first time she saw it, that it entirely transformed his face into something that made her feel a little reckless. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. The lizard completed its urgent business and vanished into the grass. He courted her with the same thoroughness he applied to everything. He came to the Calloway homestead with intention, and he wrote her letters on the weeks between their Saturday rides, which she had not expected, and the letters turned out to be remarkable. He wrote the way he spoke, but with more room to develop a thought, and the thoughts were interesting and warm and occasionally funny in the dry, understated way that she was coming to recognize as specifically his. She wrote back with enthusiasm and something approaching relief, because she had always written well and had rarely had anyone worth writing to. The autumn moved through the territory in its own particular way, the heat releasing its grip with reluctance, the days growing shorter and the nights growing sharp. Adelaide had fallen into a genuine life at the Calloway homestead, helping Ruth through her recovery, learning the rhythms of the land, putting down something that felt like roots for the first time in her adult life. She went into Callow Creek on Thursdays, and she rode with Perry on Saturdays, and she was beginning to know what she wanted with the same bone-deep certainty that he had described about his love for the land. There was a difficulty that arose in October, and it changed things. A man named Crane Dobbit had been buying up land in the area with a persistence that made the homesteaders nervous. He was a land speculator from back east, which in Arizona territory in 1882 was a category of person regarded with deep suspicion, and with good reason. He had 3 other men with him, hired hands of the kind who were paid to look intimidating rather than to do actual work, and they had been seen on the edges of various properties making notes and asking questions that ranged from intrusive to threatening. Tom Calloway had been visited twice. Tom mentioned it to Adelaide on a Tuesday morning, sitting at his kitchen table with a coffee and a frown that he was trying to manage into something less alarming. The Calloway homestead was good land, he explained, better than it looked, because there was water running underground that a man with money and equipment could get at, and Dobbit apparently knew it. Adelaide went to Callow Creek that Thursday and found Perry at Clara's already, which told her that the news had reached him before she got there. He was sitting at Clara's table with Sheriff Harlan Walsh, a conversation that had the lowered tones of men being careful about volume. She sat down and he briefed her directly, without softening it, which she appreciated. "Dobbit has filed on 2 parcels already," Perry said. Both of them were homesteads where the families had not completed their paperwork properly. He is looking for legal vulnerabilities. Tom's paperwork is in order, Adelaide said immediately, because she had spent a productive afternoon in September going through it with Tom at the kitchen table when she had nothing else to do. Perry looked at her with something new in his expression. You checked it. I organized it, indexed it, and identified 2 discrepancies that Tom then corrected, she said. Tom was not happy about the afternoon, but he was grateful about the discrepancies. Sheriff Walsh made a sound that was almost a laugh. He was a big, sandy-haired man who had been sheriff of Callow Creek for 6 years and had the particular patience of a man who had seen most things. If Calloway's paperwork is sound, Walsh said, Dobbit has no legal angle there, but he is not exclusively interested in legal angles, if you understand me. Intimidation, Adelaide said. He has not done anything I can act on yet, Walsh said, with the frustration of a man whose hands are tied by the specifics of law. But I am watching. Perry walked Adelaide back to her wagon afterward, and they stood in the street in the October afternoon, and he said, The ranch paperwork is airtight. My father was meticulous about it, and I have been equally so. Dobbit has nothing on me. What about the families who are less organized? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking about that, he said. There are 4 homesteads within range that I am concerned about. What are you going to do? I thought, he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has thought something through and is now offering it for consideration, that if there were someone willing to ride out to each of them and look at their paperwork and identify any problems before Dobbit could use them, that would be a useful thing. Adelaide looked at him. He looked back at her. Someone, she said. Someone organized, he said, with a good eye for documents and the willingness to tell people things they might not want to hear. You are asking me, she said. I am suggesting, he said, that you are uniquely suited to it, but it is entirely your choice. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. I will need to borrow Fern, she said. I cannot take the Calloway wagon to 4 different homesteads without Tom asking questions. Fern is yours whenever you need her, he said simply, and she understood that this was true in ways that extended beyond the immediate practical question. She spent the next 2 weeks visiting the 4 homesteads, alone or with Perry when he could arrange it, going through paperwork at kitchen tables with families who were variously grateful, embarrassed, defensive, and ultimately relieved. She found 2 situations that required correction. One was a matter of incorrect survey markers that Tom Calloway's neighbor, a man named Hobart, had never properly registered. The other was a filing date issue with a family named Sepulveda that had to be addressed urgently before Dobbit's lawyers could use it. She rode hard between the homesteads, and she sat at kitchen tables and explained things with the patient clarity of a woman who had no interest in making people feel stupid, but a great interest in making sure they were protected. Dr. Emmett Park, who happened to be riding past the Sepulveda place one afternoon while Adelaide was there, mentioned to Clara Hatch the next day that he had witnessed something that looked like a one-woman legal office operating out of a horse and saddlebag. Clara Hatch mentioned this to Clara's husband George, who mentioned it to 3 men at the hardware store, and by the end of the week it was general knowledge in Callow Creek that Miss Gentry from Georgia was handling the situation. Perry heard about it the way he heard about most things, from several directions at once, and the feeling it produced in him was one that he recognized, after careful consideration, as pride. Not the possessive kind, not anything so small as that, but the pure and generous kind that arises when you see someone you care about being fully and magnificently themselves. He rode out to the Calloway homestead on a Wednesday, which was not a Saturday, and that alone told Adelaide something. She met him at the door because she had heard Scout before he arrived, which was something she had noticed happening lately, an awareness of that particular horse's sound. You did not have to come out, she said. I wanted to, he said. He had his hat in his hand again, she noticed. I heard about the Sepulveda filing. It will be resolved by the end of the week, she said. Dr. Park is acting as a witness to the correction, which gives it proper standing. He looked at her in the late afternoon light and then he said, "Adelaide." It was just her name, but the way he said it made her go very still. "Come in," she said. "I have coffee." They sat at Ruth's kitchen table, Ruth being tactfully elsewhere, and he told her something he had not told anyone before. He told her that in the years since his father died, he had managed the ranch with a competence that he recognized as respectable, but a solitude that he had managed by working long hours and convincing himself that solitude was a sufficient life. He told her that he had begun to understand, somewhere in the weeks of Saturdays and letters and Thursdays in Callow Creek, that he had been wrong about that. He told her that he was not a man who said things without meaning them, and that he meant every word he was about to say, which was that he had fallen in love with her. He said it plainly and waited. Adelaide set her coffee cup down. She thought about the bruised sky and the broken axle and the man on the ridge, and the dark bay horse going down the hill toward the lights of Callow Creek, and the letter he had written about a hawk he had seen that morning that had gone on for 2 remarkable pages, and told her more about the quality of his attention than anything else could have. She thought about Fern moving steady and gentle under her on the road between homesteads, borrowed without hesitation because he would give her whatever she needed. She thought about the full, real smile that she had decided on the first night to pursue, and how many times she had been given it since. She thought about the way this land had seemed enormous and indifferent 9 weeks ago and now felt like a place that was becoming hers. "Perry," she said, "I have been in love with you since you asked Clara if you could borrow her stove to warm supper for Dobbs Alcott's wife when Dobbs finally got his axle fixed and came in." He looked at her. "Clara told you that." "Clara tells me everything," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and it was not a handshake this time. It was just his hand holding hers on the kitchen table, warm and certain and entirely right. "I should like to marry you," he said, "if you are willing. When you are ready. I do not want to rush anything that you are not sure of." "I am entirely sure," she said. "I have been entirely sure for some time. I was simply waiting for you to get there." He looked at her with something on his face that she had not seen before, something that was relief and joy and a kind of wondering disbelief all at once, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen on anyone's face in her memory. "Then yes," she said, because she wanted to be absolutely clear. "Yes to all of it." He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he kissed her for the first time, brief and deliberate, and with a restraint that was simply the character of him, and she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him back in a way that communicated with precision that she had no intention of accepting restraint as the permanent tone of things. When they stepped apart, his eyes were bright, and his expression had a quality she had never seen in it before, wide open, unguarded, purely and entirely happy. Ruth appeared in the doorway with the unerring timing of a woman who had been listening for exactly the right moment. "I have been expecting this for weeks," Ruth said. "Someone tell Tom so he can stop pretending not to know." Tom was standing behind her with the expression of a man who had indeed known. They were married in the spring, in the church with the short sermons, which turned out to be not short enough for Tom Calloway, who shifted in the pew for the last 5 minutes with the restlessness of a man with outdoors on his mind. Clara Hatch organized the reception with the efficiency she brought to everything, and the whole town came, because the whole town had apparently been invested in this outcome, since approximately the Thursday Perry Ford had crossed the street with an immediacy that several people had noticed and discussed. Adelaide wore her mother's altered dress, cream cotton with small embroidered flowers that Ruth had spent 3 weeks updating, and her hair was pinned up, but the curling ends escaped at her temples the way they always did no matter what. Perry wore a suit that had been made for him in Tucson, dark blue, and when he saw her coming down the aisle of that small church with Tom at her arm, his expression was the open, wondering one that she had decided on the day she first saw it, full and real, that she would spend her life being the cause of. The Reverend was brief, as advertised. At the reception, Sheriff Walsh told a story about Perry Ford that involved a runaway horse and a very surprised chicken farmer, and Perry took this with the patience of a man who has given up trying to stop a good story. Dr. Park danced with Clara's youngest daughter and was clearly doomed. The Sepulveda family came and brought wine they had made themselves, and the Hobart family brought a pie that became legendary by the end of the evening. Adelaide danced with her husband and thought, not for the first time but with a sharpness that made her close her eyes for a moment, about how completely and improbably wonderful a broken axle had turned out to be. "What are you thinking?" Perry asked her, because he had become very good at reading the moments when she went internal. "About Dobbs Alcott," she said, "and the debt I owe that axle." He laughed, the real laugh that was as rare and full as the real smile, and pulled her slightly closer in a manner that was absolutely appropriate for married people, and she thought she might be the luckiest woman in Arizona territory. The Greystone Ranch received her like she had always been its intention. Perry had prepared for this carefully, had spent the winter making the ranch house what it could be rather than what it had been, a working man's functional space, clean but spare and empty in the ways that a house is empty when it contains only one person, and that person does not think of comfort as a priority. He had added furniture and curtains from Tucson, a rocking chair for the porch that faced west, a proper kitchen with a cast iron stove that was better than the one in the original house, and bookshelves that he had built himself from local pine, because she had mentioned once in a letter that she had always wanted bookshelves that went to the ceiling. They went to the ceiling. She stood in the main room of the ranch house on their first evening and looked at the bookshelves and felt something move through her that had no adequate name, only the recognition that someone had listened and built what she had said. "They are magnificent," she told him. "They took longer than I expected," he said, "and I built 2 of them wrong the first time." "You rebuilt them?" "Of course." She reached up and put her hand flat on the smooth pine surface. "I will fill them," she said. "I expect you will," he said, and the way he said it with that particular certainty and warmth made her turn around and look at him in the evening light coming through the west window, and she thought, as she thought regularly, that she had made the best possible decision getting on that stagecoach in Savannah. The ranch worked because they both worked it, which surprised some people and surprised neither of them. Adelaide had not expected to be an idle person, and Perry had not expected her to be one. She learned horses quickly, which pleased him in the way that watching anyone learn something they have a natural aptitude for is pleasing, and within 6 months, she was working with the breeding mares in a way that his 4 hands, Danny and Hector and the 2 brothers named Clay and Beaumont, accepted with the pragmatic respect of men who evaluated people by whether they could do the thing and not by anything else. There was an afternoon in the late summer of their first year when a mare named Poppy was foaling badly, and Perry was in the north pasture, and Adelaide was nearest, and the ranch hand Danny came running, and she went in without hesitation and spent 3 hours at it, and both the mare and the foal came through. And when Perry rode in as the sun was going down and found her covered in the evidence of the afternoon, sitting on a fence rail watching the foal figure out its legs, she looked at him over her shoulder and said, "It's a colt. He needs a name." Perry looked at the colt, which was dark bay with a white star, obviously his father's son in every line. "You name him," Perry said. "You earned it." She thought about it while the colt wobbled and Poppy attended him with the fierce, devoted efficiency of a good mother. "Charter," she said. "Charter," he agreed. Danny, who had witnessed the whole afternoon and had a story to tell for the rest of his life about it, said nothing because he understood that the moment was not his. They had been married 2 years when their son was born. The winter of 1884 brought the baby in February, and Perry Ford handled the months of preparation with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, which in this case involved reading 3 different medical guides, consulting Dr. Emmett Park approximately once a fortnight, and building a cradle from the same pine as the bookshelves that was, Adelaide told him firmly, the most beautiful piece of furniture she had ever seen. Dr. Park delivered the baby on a cold, clear morning with Clara Hatch in attendance as a matter of practical course, and Ruth Calloway, who had ridden out at dawn when the labor began. Ruth having become exactly the kind of woman who rode out at dawn in cold weather when her cousin needed her. The baby was a boy, 7 pounds and abundantly healthy, with Perry's dark hair and Adelaide's gray eyes, and a set of lungs that introduced himself to the Arizona territory with considerable authority. Perry held him in the late morning while Adelaide rested, and the expression on his face was one that was entirely new and that Adelaide, watching from the bed with her eyes at half-mast, thought she would spend the rest of her life being grateful to have seen. It was undefended love, pure and enormous and slightly stunned, the face of a careful man encountering something that could not be responded to with care but only with openness. "James," Adelaide said, "for your father." Perry looked up at her, and his eyes were bright in a way that she had seen only a few times before, and that she knew he would not acknowledge later but that she treasured each time. "James," he said. James Ford came into the world, and the world of the Greystone Ranch adjusted itself around him, with the natural accommodation of a place that had room for him. The Hands, who were already fond of Adelaide in the practical way of men who respect demonstrated competence, transferred some of this to James immediately. Danny in particular took to calling him the little boss with an affection that was entirely sincere. The Calloway homestead, meanwhile, had expanded. Tom had built a proper barn, and Ruth was expecting their first child by the spring, and the 4 of them had fallen into the comfortable pattern of families who live close enough to matter to each other and far enough to maintain their own lives. Sunday dinners rotated. Tom and Perry had developed a working partnership that included shared equipment and mutual assistance during the labor-intensive seasons, and the 2 women had a friendship that was one of the best things in either of their lives. Crane Dobbett, who had troubled them all the previous year, had eventually come up against the combined solidity of properly filed paperwork and a sheriff who watched him with unblinking attention, and he had taken his business interests elsewhere. The territory would always have men like him, Adelaide understood, men who came with money and intentions into places where people were trying to build something real. But what she had also learned in her years out here now was that communities like the one around Callow Creek had their own resilience, built from the accumulated weight of people who showed up for each other. She thought about this sometimes when she was riding Fern through the ranch in the mornings, the baby in the house with Rosaria, the young woman from town who helped them several days a week, and the land spreading out in all its colors around her. The territory was enormous and still largely indifferent, but it was no longer strange to her. It was hers. The autumn of the second year of James's life brought several things at once. Charter, the bay colt Adelaide had named on the fence rail, was 2 years old now and in training, and it was becoming clear that he was exceptional, the best of the horses Perry had bred in several years. He had his sire Scout's movement, and his damn Poppy's temperament, and a quality of intelligence in his eyes that Perry's most experienced hand, Hector, said he had seen only once or twice in his career. Perry worked with Charter every morning with the patient, unhurried method he brought to horse training, and Adelaide watched when she could and learned from watching, because watching Perry Ford work with horses was its own form of education. A man came from Tucson to look at the Greystone horses, a buyer named Aldrich, who represented a remount operation that supplied horses to various parties including the Army. He watched Charter move for an hour and made an offer that was, Perry acknowledged privately, considerable. Perry told him no. Adelaide heard about this from Hector, not from Perry, because Perry had not mentioned it. He turned it down, she asked. Hector, who was a man of few words and those words carefully chosen, said, he said the horse was not for sale. She found Perry in the barn that evening cleaning tack in the way he did when he had something on his mind, methodical and thorough. You turned down Aldrich, she said. He did not look up from the bridle he was working on. Charter is not ready to sell, he said, and possibly not ever. That money would have done considerable things, she said, not accusing, just stating. I know what it would have done, he said. I made a calculation. She waited, because she knew him well enough to know that he would continue when he was ready. He looked up then, and his expression was the careful one, the private one, that he only wore when he was about to say something that cost him something. Your first night here, he said, you rode in on Fern. And I remember watching you ride down that hill toward the lights of town, and thinking that this mare I had raised from a foal was carrying something worth carrying carefully. He paused. Charter is Poppy's son. He carries Fern's bloodline on his damn side and Scout's on his sire's. He is not a commodity to me. He is what all of this has built. He put the bridle down and looked at her directly. The money is not worth it. Adelaide looked at her husband in the lamplight of the barn, this careful, thorough, deeply feeling man who had once been alone on a ridge above a broken axle and had come down to help a stranger without hesitation. And she thought again, as she thought so often, how extraordinary and simple and total was the love she had for him. All right, she said. Charter stays. He looked at her with the open face. You agree? I always agreed, she said. I just wanted to hear you explain it. He picked up the bridle again and went back to his work, but the set of his shoulders was different, easier, and she went to sit on the hay bale near him, and they stayed in the comfortable quiet of the barn, while the horses moved in their stalls and James slept in the house, and the autumn stars came out above the territory. In the spring of 1885, Ruth had her baby, a girl named Fiona, and Adelaide was there for it the same way Ruth had been there for James, riding out at dawn in the cold, sitting at the kitchen table making coffee and keeping Tom Calloway from climbing the walls with anxiety, which was a considerable contribution to the general welfare. Fiona was small and ferocious and had Ruth's dark eyes and Tom's stubborn jaw, and James Ford, who was a year and 3 months old and newly walking, regarded her during their first meeting with the profound solemnity of a child encountering something new that requires evaluation. He looks like a little judge, Ruth said. He takes after his father, Adelaide said. Perry, standing behind her holding James, looked pleased about this. The years settled into themselves with the weight of good things, not without difficulty, because the territory always had difficulty available, the droughts and the distances and the work that never fully finished, but with the particular solidity of lives being built by people who had committed to the building. There was a drought in the summer of 1886 that was hard on everyone. The grass came up thin, and the water in the creek ran low, and the cattle required moving to find pasture, and the horses had to be monitored carefully. Perry worked 18-hour days, and his 4 hands worked alongside him with a loyalty that Adelaide found moving, and that Perry acknowledged in the straightforward way of a man who trusts the people who work with him. She organized the household and the ranch records with the efficiency that had become recognized as one of the things the Greystone ran on, and she drove to Callow Creek twice a week to see to supplies and to check on neighbors who were struggling. There was a family, the Morrisons, who had come out 2 years before with 3 children and hope and not much else, and who were now in the kind of difficulty that is hard to come back from. Adelaide brought food from the Greystone stores on 4 separate occasions, and Perry arranged for Clay and Beaumont to help Morrison mend the fences that had gone down in the dry wind, and no accounting was done and no debt recorded, because that was not how it worked out here. Adelaide thought sometimes, in the quiet of the evenings when James was asleep and Perry was reading at the table, about what it meant to live in a place where the injustices were real and visible, and sometimes addressed and sometimes not. The territory was hard on women in ways that were not always acknowledged, on Mexican families like the Sepulvedas who had been here before the territory was a territory, and who were still treated as newcomers by people who had arrived last year, on the Apache people whose land this had been, and who had been displaced with a violence that the newspapers of the time regarded as progress, and that Adelaide regarded with a more complicated feeling that she expressed carefully, and honestly when the subject arose, which was not always comfortable, but which she held to anyway. She talked to Perry about these things in the evenings, and he listened with the full attention he gave to things he considered important, which was most things she said. He did not always agree with her framing, but he engaged with it seriously and honestly, and that quality, the willingness to think carefully about hard things, was one of the things she loved most deeply in him. The drought broke in September of 1886, with 3 days of extraordinary rain that filled the creek and darkened the soil, and brought the grass back with a speed that felt almost theatrical. James, who was 2.5 and had strong opinions about everything, stood on the porch in his nightshirt while his mother held his hand and watched the rain come down with an expression of total satisfaction. "Rain," he announced. "Yes," Adelaide said. "Good rain," James said. "Very good rain," she agreed. Perry came up behind them on the porch, fresh from the barn where he had been seeing to the horses, his shirt soaked through, and put his hand on her shoulder and watched the rain with them. She leaned back slightly, and he curved around her in the easy way of people who have learned each other thoroughly, and James looked up at his parents with the contented expression of a child who has everything he needs. By the fall of 1887, Adelaide was expecting again. This pregnancy moved differently than the first, easier in some ways and more consuming in others, and she continued riding until she could not comfortably do so, which was later than Perry was entirely comfortable with, though he understood better than to say so more than once. She did say, on a morning in late July when she dismounted from Fern and found Perry watching from the corral gate with that expression of not quite saying something, "I know my own body, Perry Ford." "I know you do," he said. "Then stop looking at me like that." "I am simply looking," he said, with a restraint that she found at this particular moment in her 8th month quite admirable. She went inside and made coffee and forgave him for looking, because she understood that it was love and not doubt. The second baby was born in October of 1887, another boy, and Perry held him in the same light-filled way he had held James, and James, 3.5 years old and fully verbal on the subject of his opinions, stood at the edge of the bed and regarded his brother with the judicial expression that was becoming his signature. "He is very small," James observed. "You are very small," Adelaide told him. James considered this, and apparently found it insufficient explanation for the smallness of the new person, but accepted it provisionally. "He is William," Perry said, and Adelaide had not expected him to offer a name first and looked at him with the surprised pleasure that had not diminished in 4 years of marriage. "William," she said, trying it. "For whom?" "For no one in particular," he said. "It just seems like his name." It did. William Ford arrived in October, and the world again adjusted itself around him. Clara Hatch brought a meal and advice that was simultaneously identical to, and entirely different from the advice she had given at James's birth. And Ruth came out with Fiona, who was 2.5 and regarded baby William, with the expert assessment of someone who had also been subjected to arrival of a new small person and found it survivable. The winter of 1887 was the warmest they had had in years, which was a gift, and Adelaide recovered quickly and was back in the saddle by December, which Perry accepted with the philosophical grace of a man who had learned which battles were not battles. The Greystone horses continued to be sought after, and Perry's reputation as a horseman had spread in the way that genuine quality spreads, by the testimony of the people who had used the horses and found them as good as advertised. Charter, the bay colt whom Adelaide had named on the fence rail, and who Perry had refused to sell, was now 4 years old and had become Perry's primary working horse, Scout being semi-retired to a comfortable life in the home pasture. Charter was everything they had expected him to be and more, with a quality of responsiveness to Perry that Hector said only happened when a man and a horse had a particular kind of understanding. Adelaide rode Charter twice, which the hands considered an event of some note. The horse was not difficult for her, but he was different from Fern, more alive under her, requiring more of her attention, and she found it enormously satisfying in the way that demanding things are satisfying when you meet them on their own terms. He likes you, Perry told her, watching from the fence with James beside him. James now 4 and already spending every possible minute near the horses. He is tolerating me, Adelaide said, bringing Charter in. That is how Charter likes people, Perry said. She laughed and Charter pricked his ears at the sound, which she considered a positive sign. James Ford turned 5 in the spring of 1889, and it was evident to everyone who knew him that he was made of an equal mixture of both his parents. He had Perry's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and his mother's directness and his father's careful attention, and a combination of both their stubbornness that was something entirely its own. He had also, by the age of 5, demonstrated an absolute and consuming devotion to horses that pleased Perry enormously, and made Adelaide reflect on the particular way love propagates through families. She had a letter from her mother in Savannah that spring, one of the regular letters they exchanged, in which her mother wrote that Adelaide's younger brother Henry was thinking of coming west. Her mother wrote about it with the circumspection of a woman who was not entirely sure how she felt about losing another child to the territory, but who also knew that the territory had given Adelaide something that Georgia had not been able to provide. Adelaide read the letter twice and then showed it to Perry at the supper table. He read it with the careful attention he gave everything. "He is welcome," he said. "You have not met him," she said. "You have spoken of him at length," Perry said. "He sounds like a person of considerable ability and some direction-finding difficulty. Both are manageable." She wrote back to her mother and to Henry with the same mail, and Henry arrived in June of that year on the same stagecoach line that had brought Adelaide, though with an intact axle. He was 22, 4 years younger than Adelaide, with her same gray eyes and a broader face, and a naturally useful disposition that meant he was helping at the Greystone within a week and working it properly within a month. Danny, who was not a man who gave approval easily, told Perry within the first 2 weeks that Henry Gentry was a good hand and learned fast, and Perry relayed this to Adelaide with the brevity that meant he was pleased. Henry found the territory as overwhelming as Adelaide had and as irresistible. He fell into the life of the ranch with the enthusiasm of a young man discovering his proper context, and he found in Callow Creek a small community of people his own age, including a young woman named Vera Peretz, the daughter of the dry goods family, who had Adelaide's immediate approval on grounds of both character and common sense. The summer of 1889 was good. The grass was up and the cattle were healthy, and Charter had a colt of his own, a dark bay with his father's star and his grandmother Poppy's quiet temperament, that James named immediately and without consultation. "Jupiter," James announced. Perry looked at his son with the expression of a man conducting an evaluation. "Jupiter," Perry agreed. Adelaide wrote all of this down, not in a diary exactly, more in the long, detailed letters she sent home to her mother, because she had been writing these letters for 6 years now, and they constituted, she sometimes thought, a record of the life the territory had given her. She kept her mother's replies in a box on the shelf Perry had built, the shelf that was now full of the books she had accumulated over the years, filling the bookshelves that went to the ceiling. On an evening in October of 1889, 7 years after a man on a ridge above a broken axle had come down to offer his horse to a stranded woman from Georgia, Adelaide sat on the porch of the Greystone Ranch house in the rocking chair that faced west and watched the sun go down over the territory. James was inside learning to read with his father at the kitchen table, their voices coming out through the window in the low, patient exchange of a man teaching a child, and a child who was putting things together fast. William, just 2 years old, was asleep in his room with the complete unconscious confidence of a child who has never questioned that the world is safe for him. The sky was doing what the Arizona sky did best, going through colors that had no adequate names in English or possibly any other language, the reds and oranges and pinks building on each other until the whole west was on fire. Adelaide had a cup of tea going cold on the porch rail, and she was thinking, in the comfortable, unfocused way of evenings, about the morning she had arrived. She thought about the trunk on the roadside and the $4.30 and the enormous indifferent land, and the shape on the ridge against the bruised sky that had resolved itself into Perry Ford on Scout with the whole rest of her life in tow. She thought about the question she had asked Clara Hatch over the supper dishes that first night, the directness she had never quite trained out of herself putting itself to use. Who is the cowboy? Who is this man? Tell me everything. She thought about what Clara had told her, and how all of it had proved entirely insufficient to contain what Perry Ford actually was, because the things that mattered most about him were the things that could not be summarized over dishes. The things that revealed themselves in letters and mornings and difficult decisions, and the way he held a sleeping child, and the way he looked at horses, and the way he looked at her. The door opened behind her, and he came out onto the porch, evidently having concluded the reading lesson to everyone's satisfaction, and he leaned against the porch post and looked at the sky with the proprietary appreciation of a man who loves a landscape. He read 3 whole sentences, Perry said. 3, she said. He will be insufferable about it. He is already insufferable about it, Perry agreed, with the warm pride of a man who finds this entirely acceptable. They stood and sat there in the October evening with the sky doing its extraordinary work, and the crickets beginning in the sage, and the horses moving in the near pasture, and the specific fullness of a life that had been built from a beginning as unlikely as a broken axle on a road in the middle of nowhere. Perry, she said. Adelaide, he said. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and she thought of the moment on the hill 7 years ago when he had said this land is better shared, and she had said, I believe that is true. I would like to have another child, she said, whenever you are agreeable. He looked at her with the open face, the one that was unguarded and full, the one she had collected like a treasure over these years because he did not give it easily and gave it to her completely. I am extremely agreeable, he said. She held out her hand and he took it, and they stood on the porch of the ranch that had been his father's and was now theirs, watching the sun go down over the land that was both enormous and entirely known to them, while inside their sons breathed in their separate rooms, and the bookshelves went to the ceiling, and the horses moved in the evening pasture, and Charter's colt Jupiter found his legs in the dusk, and it was complete. Their 3rd child, a daughter, was born in the summer of 1890, and they named her Clara, which made Clara Hatch cry in a way that she immediately and unconvincingly denied, and which pleased Adelaide enormously. Clara Ford arrived in June with her mother's curling hair and her father's coffee-colored eyes, and an expression of immediate and comprehensive interest in everything around her that Adelaide recognized as a family trait. James, who was 6 and serious, inspected his sister with his habitual assessment expression, and then declared her acceptable. William, who was 2.5 and less interested in philosophical evaluation than in immediate action, tried to give her his toy horse and was gently redirected. Perry held his daughter in the morning light, and he said, simply, "Hello, Clara," with a tenderness that made Adelaide, watching from the bed, feel all the way through to her spine. Henry Gentry married Vera Peretz the following spring, in the same church with the same short sermons, and Adelaide stood beside her cousin Ruth in the front pew and thought about the ways that one arrival could change everything around it, the ripples going outward from that broken axle, her own life and Henry finding his, and all the good, ordinary, extraordinary things that had followed. The ranch in 1891 was a different thing from the ranch Perry had run alone in 1882. It had 4 full-time hands, including Danny, who was now so established that he had built himself a small house on the property with Perry's enthusiastic assistance. It had a full breeding program with Charter at its center, and Jupiter coming up through his training as the next generation's foundation. It had a house with bookshelves to the ceiling, and 3 children in it at various stages of being loud and curious and attached to horses. It had Adelaide Gentry Ford, who ran the business records with the efficiency that had become something of a legend among the neighboring ranches, who rode out to check on neighbors the way she had in the first year she arrived, who wrote long, truthful letters to her mother in Savannah and received long, truthful letters in return, and who sat on the west-facing porch in the evenings and was, in the most complete and unambiguous sense of the word, home. Clara Hatch came for supper on a Sunday that autumn, as she did several times a year, and after the meal when the children were in bed and Henry and Vera had ridden back to their own place and Tom and Ruth had taken the wagon home with Fiona asleep in the back, Clara sat on the porch with Adelaide and Perry and a pot of coffee and the full dark Arizona sky above them. "This has turned out well," Clara said, with the satisfaction of a woman who regards the happiness of people she loves as a project well completed. "You helped," Adelaide told her. "I heated up supper," Clara said. "The rest was the two of you." Perry, who was rarely given to reflection of the stated kind, said, "It started with a horse." Both women looked at him. "Fern carrying her down the hill," he said. "That is where it started, I think." Adelaide thought about this. Fern, patient and gentle and sure-footed in the dark, carrying her toward the lights of a town she did not know yet and a life she had not yet imagined. "It started before that," she said. "It started with Scout on the ridge." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the years between that ridge and this porch moved through the look between them with all their weight and all their texture, the droughts and the foals and the letters and the mornings and the three small voices asleep inside. "Well," Clara said, finishing her coffee with the contentment of a woman at peace with the world she has helped to arrange, "howsoever it started, it has come to exactly where it should be." The Greystone Ranch sat under the stars of the Arizona Territory on an autumn night in 1891, solid and lit from within, with horses moving in the pasture and children breathing in their rooms and two people on the porch who had found each other on a stretch of broken road and had been building, from that unlikely beginning, something that would outlast them both. The land stretched away in all directions, enormous and no longer indifferent, because the people who lived on it had filled it with their care, and the care had made it, unmistakably and permanently, theirs. Adelaide reached for Perry's hand in the dark of the porch, and he took it without looking, because he always knew where she was, and they stayed there while the stars did their extravagant work above the territory, and the night was full of the sounds of a life that was exactly what a life should be.